The United States has a problem. The Chinese Navy has officially become the world's largest navy. Thankfully, the capabilities of the Chinese Navy are decades behind that of the American Navy, but in any confrontation with China, the US Navy will at best only be able to call upon 60% of its fleet, thanks to naval commitments elsewhere in the world. When forced to face off against just over half of the US fleet, the Chinese Navy's chances for victory in any Pacific conflict quickly escalate. For now, though, the US Navy doesn't need to worry. China is still not a true blue water navy that's capable of operating for extended periods of time far away from its own shores, although it has sent task forces to the Horn of Africa to aid in anti-piracy efforts. Overall, on a ship-to-ship basis, the Chinese Navy's technology ranges from a decade to 4 decades behind the United States, especially amongst its very noisy submarine forces. Yet the situation is quickly changing. China has in recent years funded a major investment in its naval forces, which has resulted in a frenzy of shipbuilding. Currently, China outbuilds the United States when it comes to ships. Though again, it's important to remember that the capabilities of each ship so far fails to match up to those of American ships. Also, this is still the initial surge phase of China's new modern navy. After reaching a predetermined target number of ships, the shipbuilding frenzy will slow to a rate similar to the US's. China's growing naval might is worrying not just the United States, but many of China's own neighbors who have routinely been bullied by China's growing might. Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam, to name a few, all have serious disputes with China, which has on numerous times claimed territory rightfully within their territorial waters for itself. China's frenzy of island building in the South China Sea has also sparked international concerns, and while President Obama's shifting of naval power to the Pacific quickly halted the island expansions, China has so far refused to vacate the 5 islands it has built. This is in spite of a ruling by The Hague which dismissed China's fanciful claims to the region. Instead, China has fortified its South China Sea holdings, adding radars, flight lines for combat planes, and missile defense systems. The message is clear: China is not budging. While the US is not seeking a military confrontation with China, its commitments to defend many of the nations that China is currently bullying or intimidating may force its hand. In that case, the US may find itself with its hands full dealing with Chinese naval and ballistic missile power, unless radical reforms of the American Navy take place. The greatest threat to American naval forces in the Pacific is China's staggeringly large stockpile of anti-ship ballistic missiles. These giant missiles can be fired from the heart of China and guided to their target as far out in the Pacific as Guam by a system of space and airborne radar and targeting assets. With thousands of these missiles, the US fleet appears to be in serious jeopardy. To counter the ballistic missile threat from China, the US Navy has adopted a doctrine of dispersed operations. While in the past, battle groups would be centered around an aircraft carrier to fight relatively close together, the new doctrine has led the Navy to widely disperse its battle groups so as to make each individual ship harder to hit. New investments in anti-ballistic missile systems have also added robust capabilities to American fleets, and a new generation of anti-missile missiles have performed very well in testing. Yet a major problem for the US Navy is the sheer number of ballistic and conventional missiles China could throw at American ships. While it's highly unlikely that China would be able to achieve air superiority against the US Navy, new extremely long-range anti-ship missiles would see China fighters able to use their weapons against American ships from hundreds of miles away and never even get close to American interceptors meant to protect their ships from this threat. Then there's the threat posed by Chinese submarines, which could fire off anti-ship missiles while lurking under the waves. They would need to be closer to their American targets than Chinese jets, but would still be able to operate far outside of the traditional security envelope established around American battle groups. One solution to these twin problems is to simply push out the radius of the security envelope around a battle group. Unmanned refueling tankers are already being deployed amongst American fleets, and this will allow a carrier's combat air patrol to operate much further away than normal, which will let them intercept Chinese aircraft before getting close enough to fire. To counter the submarine threat, the US Navy, under its Ghost Fleet Overlord program, has been testing autonomous ships that can assist manned ships in combat. One of these ships is an anti-submarine warfare platform, which would patrol the waters around a battle group completely on its own, searching for Chinese subs and engaging any discovered. Another key to defending American ships in the Pacific is a heavy investment into technologies and tools to disrupt China's kill chains, or a chain of assets required to successfully launch a ballistic missile and accurately guide it to its target 1,000 miles away. This includes space-based and airborne surveillance and radar platforms, as well as communication nodes, and while details remain classified, the US so far remains confident that it can disrupt China's kill chain capabilities enough to protect most of its ships. For their part, the Chinese have never demonstrated they have the sophistication to implement and protect a kill chain system that can successfully target and destroy a ship far out at sea. New plans are calling for a heavy investment by the US in anti-ballistic missile systems, such as directed energy weapons and kinetic interceptors such as railguns. Currently, one of the biggest problems with protecting American fleets is not an inability to accurately target and destroy incoming missiles, but simply that China would rely on overwhelming barrages meant to force US ships to expend all the missiles in their batteries trying to protect themselves. Once each ship's battery is depleted, it is for all intents and purposes defenseless against incoming missiles, especially of the ballistic variety. A directed energy weapon would have no magazine size limits, as it would fire off electrical power generated by the ship. It could fire for as long as the ships generate electricity and intercept incoming missiles at the speed of light, making it incredibly accurate. High-energy lasers could burn out missile warheads and guidance electronics, causing them to prematurely detonate or simply fly out of control. Kinetic railgun interceptors would still need a magazine of projectiles, but these projectiles are both much cheaper to produce than a modern missile and can be made much smaller. A single railgun battery could hold hundreds of rounds for a fraction of the cost of a traditional vertical launch cell on a big warship. But even those innovations aren't enough to successfully defeat China at sea, because the fact remains that China has invested extremely heavily in both anti-ship ballistic and traditional missiles. To make matters worse, the US Navy's current ship designs are only making China's job of destroying them easier. For decades, US ships were built around extremely powerful suites of radar and other sensors, which gave them incredible situational awareness and command of their battle space. But in a modern war also make them incredibly easy targets to find for any sophisticated foe, such as China. In essence, US ships and their sensor systems put out so much electronic noise that finding them out at sea would be easy for China, as it would be for you to find a screaming person in a pitch-black room. High-energy sensor systems are an absolute necessity for any naval force, so simply doing away with them is not realistic. Instead, the Navy needs to seriously rethink its current force structure. At the moment, the US Navy is very destroyer and cruiser heavy. It's the biggest, meanest guy on the block and packs the strongest right hook in the world. To defeat China and not suffer catastrophic losses in doing so, the American Navy needs to go on a serious diet and slim down. Rather than relying on traditional concentrations of big destroyers and guided missile cruisers, the US Navy needs to slash funding for those large ships and invest in a force of mid-range ships about half the size of a modern destroyer. These smaller ships would carry less ordnance, but would be cheaper to build, maintain, and operate, and could be fielded in large numbers versus smaller numbers of bigger ships. These medium-sized ships would be widely dispersed across a battle space, and thanks to their sheer numbers and smaller profiles, enough of them could get close enough to Chinese forces with an acceptable degree of risk that they could take advantage of passive sensors to track and target Chinese ships and shore targets. Passive sensor systems put out much less energy than active systems, and thus a larger network of smaller ships could relay targeting data back to the main battle group, while remaining relatively undetected. America's big guns could safely remain undetected at sea and still be able to service targets accurately. New studies call for these smaller ships to be completely unmanned, or at least optionally manned with crews no greater than 24. In fact, the US Navy is looking to adopt unmanned ships in a big way, literally, and the service is right now testing 2 large unmanned ships. Under program Ghost Fleet Overlord, the US Navy intends to build several large unmanned vessels, or LUVs, to support its traditional manned forces. The goal of these LUVs will be to offset the risk of battle groups being overwhelmed by saturation strikes and expending all of their missile batteries in self-defense. In essence, each LUV will be nothing more than a seaborne missile battery, housing hundreds of missiles, which could either be fired remotely at targets or used to resupply battle groups at sea. Nicknamed Arsenal ships, the concept dates back to the 1980s, and each individual ship could carry about half the firepower of an entire battle group. That's a hell of a lot of punch in just one ship, but many experts fear that that's exactly the problem. These big robotic missile ships will still rely on extremely powerful active sensor systems that will be easy for Chinese forces to spot and target. Arsenal ships also have one other major downside. They serve no purpose outside of an actual war. Unlike traditional manned ships, Arsenal ships could not be deployed on training missions, relationship-building missions with a friendly country, or counterterrorism missions. They would have only a single use, in only a single scenario, giving the Navy a lot less bang for its buck, dollar for dollar. Instead, experts are calling for the Navy to switch from large robotic Arsenal ships to the fleet of smaller unmanned or optionally manned ships we discussed earlier. Not only will this give the Navy a much greater survivability against Chinese missile forces, but the ships could still carry out a range of peacetime missions as well. In fact, a recent study showed that for the same price, the US Navy could actually get 1.4 times the missile tubes going with a fleet of smaller ships than the current plan to purchase lower numbers of big robot arsenal ships. In the end, hopefully the Navy never needs to implement any of its plans to defeat China at sea, as nobody wants to see a confrontation between the two nations. Yet, for the US and many of the South Pacific nations that have found themselves bullied by China in the last decade and a half, it's a comforting thought to know the US Navy is always preparing for that unfortunate happenstance. Now that you've gotten through this video, why not learn more about the world we live in by clicking this video over here? Or if that doesn't do it for you, why not try out this other one instead? Go ahead, click that button and learn something new and exciting right now.